Welcome. The council is in session. This has been a long time waiting. Welcome to Prashant Khanna. We at the council at Nation of Sport, exclusively at Nation of Sport here, discuss how sports has gone from a absolute pastime, jao beta khelo, after studies, to a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it is growing at an unprecedented pace. My guest today with me is a good friend. He's somebody who is a sounding board, very generously so, I must say that. I keep bouncing, I keep throwing ideas at him. I'm waiting for him to get pissed off and upset with one of my ideas one day. It's like, stop calling me with these ideas. But Prashant Khanna, welcome to the show. Prashant has had over a decade of experience in the sports media. He has a double major from the Cruyff Institute of Sports Management Studies, is an SAF accredited coach, which I didn't know about. We'll talk about that maybe. You have also consulted with a bunch of gaming companies and other sports companies, and currently you are head of broadcast technology at Star Sports.
That's right.
What needs to be mentioned is that you are also a shareholder in Manchester United, which you say is one of your proudest achievements. Would that be accurate to say?
Yeah, I mean, technically, considering I get the voting rights, so I sometimes get insider news purely by, I can't declare how many shares, but they're not too many. But it's still interesting because, you get to know what's happening within the club.
The reason I mention this is because the first 5 podcast guests at the council have all been Manchester United, die-hard Manchester United fans. And, apologies to David who keeps throwing stuff at me. This was not intentional. It totally was unintentional. Just so happens to be that there are so many Manchester United fans out there, and a lot of you happen to work in the sports space. So welcome, Prashant, to the council.
Glad to be here.
So we'll start off with the first question that we ask everybody. Prashant Khanna, do you think India is a nation of sport?
I don't think so yet. We've always predominantly been a one sport country, and that too is cricket, because it's run in our system for over 150 years. It's very different for other sports that you see now. IPL was also cricket. That essentially convinced people and parents or anybody else that you could put food on the table. Playing sport essentially. So I don't think we're still there, but things have changed drastically in the last 5 to 7 years.
Right.
But I would still say we are largely a one sport country, even as of today.
Right. If you, what are the 1 or 2 things you see moving towards becoming, because you use the word yet, we are not yet a sports country. What are the 1 or 2 things you see moving us as a country towards becoming a nation of sport?
So I think what's really and absolutely critical is grassroots. That's how every other country over a period of time has developed. The kids, the younger generation has to be involved, and those are your stars, couple of years later. To give you an example, sport like football, ISL experienced it in the first 2 or 3 seasons. They brought in big players, they brought in a lot of fanfare, but eventually what failed was the actual game on the field.
Right.
You always had, the intensity was missing, it wasn't there. And you see that change now.
Right.
You see, season 5, 6 now where they've invested in younger players. The game's far more attractive, and that's probably, and mostly coming from the fact that these are kids who've essentially played here over a period of time. And that's the difference. That's really, grassroots is really the difference to developing us, as a system.
Right. And it's interesting you bring up the ISL and how maybe in the first year, the product that they put out on the pitch was not the greatest and how it's improving. But that's also because one of the things people criticize the ISL for, all the time. And maybe they have valid reasons, maybe they don't. But I think one of the greatest things they did was mandating teams to spend an X amount of money on grassroots every year. Mm-hmm. I was fortunate enough to be, I mentioned this on an earlier podcast, I was fortunate enough to be part of Mumbai City FC that won the best grassroots program the first 3 seasons. And I firsthand got to see how in terms of grassroots, not just creating talent, but being able to even create that fan base of yours, because you had so many of these kids who brought their parents, who suddenly, because there was a structured grassroots program, they became better players. And the more, when you become better at something, you start to fall in love with it, right? It's a old age. So then their parents get involved, and so automatically treating that one playing coaching that one kid has created this ecosystem of fans plus this entire support system that comes through. So yeah, I mean ISL is a great example from that. Any other thing that you're seeing as a trend that's pushing or moving India towards becoming a nation of sport?
I think it's broadcast is playing a big part,
Right.
in that. The visibility. You're seeing so many sports. You're seeing so many. There have been multiple initiatives. Kabaddi, which became so big recently.
Crazy story though it is.
Yeah, and there is a junior kabaddi that happens as well, which is actually broadcast
Yes.
every Sunday.
Yes.
And those are the kind of things that are essentially making you realize that you can be part of multiple things. Earlier,
Right.
you would only see probably the Doordarshan only used to show recorded games and something that's not very recent. So the visibility, the amount of sports content that's available today, and the access that is available today is automatically making you believe that you can be part of something like this as you go along. Whether it is on the playing side or whether it's on the administrative side, just being involved in sports is something that's happening now.
Right, and what's interesting with kabaddi is because it was a sport that was largely written off towards say rural areas or rural India, village India, right? But suddenly with this increase in its reputation, you have kids in the urban cities who want to play the sport again. It's like kids from these big schools who never understood what kabaddi is now are just not only interested in watching the game but playing the sport. Right. And for me, I think that I think what you hit the nail on the head when you said broadcast is a huge change for us. For you personally, though, you work in the broadcast space. You've been working in it for a while. As a matter of fact, I'll come back. Before we move into the next question, I want you to be able to draw some sort of context for readers is why broadcast is so important for you, because you have some interesting stories about how you started your career in broadcast and where you are today. So, go.
Yeah, so it's, it's really interesting, from a time when people didn't really know, when the Balaji shows were really, really popular, and you had very little sport that used to happen as part of Star. Sports was very, very small at that time. Sony, I don't think, did any sports at that point. Prime Sports actually was the bigger brand at that point, and even a lot of content what people don't realize today was actually recorded. So some of your shows that happen today, what you actually see back in India sitting in my room, people don't realize that the actual telecast of that happened outside of the country somewhere, and the tapes had to be physically flown by people. They would be sent there, then they would be played out of there over the next day or so. Right. And majority of the times today we have fiber connectivity, and you can get content from one place to another in a matter of seconds. Right. It would normally take about 12-14 hours before you could figure out the best flight possible to get you to deliver the content there. And those are things that have changed, from our times where we saw a lot of, we used to call them tape monkeys, essentially carrying
Yes, I remember this phrase.
And making sure that it's made, it's on there at the right time.
For the benefit of our viewers and listeners, can you give an example of what a tape monkey does on it in a typical week, for instance?
Yeah, so you would identify next week what are the 4 flights or 5 flights, and you would typically do. So if it's 4 episodes going on air from Monday to Thursday, you would need to ensure that the tape reaches or is available one day before it's telecast. So it's quality checked and it's made available to air. So you would typically fly in, and at that point in time, Hong Kong, Singapore were didn't have that many connections. You had 2 or 3 service providers that would fly there, and you would eventually get there one day before, spend the day, make sure the tape's available, take the flight the next day back, and you're back again to figure out what's the next flight that you could potentially take. So it was really interesting. You're pretty much you would know what menu is going to get served on the flight. You would know pretty much the entire crew. And yeah, those were really interesting and intense times to, how we now in a digital world deliver content and, distribute. And it's a lot more easier. You don't have to worry about the next
now
flight.
You just have to go to Andheri Sports Complex and broadcast a football match as opposed to some other place.
Absolutely.
So, So you've seen that journey, and personally, I haven't met somebody who's seen that. People talk about, oh, we've come a long way. Like you have come a long. You've traveled a long way for it. Um, what are the two things? What is the biggest change in terms of A, technology, and B, culturally, that you see in broadcast in India? So let's go with technologically. What is the biggest change you've seen? I would say, um, and usually people say that change in India has been coming over 10 years. I really like the fact that you mentioned it's actually been only 5 to 7 years. People don't realize that. They like to say 10 because it's a big round figure. But I genuinely think 5 to 7 is a more accurate. So in the past 5 to 7 years, what is the biggest technological change in terms of sports broadcast in India we have seen?
So I would say one, the biggest advantage being technology has become a lot cheaper, to make sure that you're getting more games and, being able to broadcast more games for people. Two, nobody thought that India would invest the kind of money that, broadcasters have today to make sure they pick up those rights and embellish and, use technology to bring an experience that you've probably never seen before, or you would associate to an international broadcast, to an extent.
Yes.
So that's a really, really big change, from understanding that it's not just buying the rights and bringing the game on air. It is also how do you use technology to embellish every single aspect of what you're bringing to your viewer.
Right.
And using technology to, whether it is customization of languages or whether it is customization of graphics or whether it is customization of even what you see visually, is a really, really big change, that automatically interests various pockets, within the country of saying, my sport is coming to me. It's not just restricted to an English or a Hindi environment.
Right.
And that's what technology has done really well. Earlier, to give you an example, we've had instances now where sports traditionally is broadcast over satellite. Today, we are actually evaluating options where we don't even use satellite to broadcast sport. So,
Okay.
you don't even use fiber to broadcast sport.
Give the dummies an explanation of how
Yeah,
that
so
works.
what's really interesting is today you have technologies, we all use mobile phones, right? And
Right.
we use devices which are called GSM bonding devices. What they essentially do for you is you put 10 SIM cards. 10 SIM cards so if you get 1 MB of bandwidth on one SIM card, you typically get 20 MB. And what you would do then is you would use that device to broadcast your camera signal onto your broadcast location. So you're not even going through satellite, you can avoid all regulatory permissions. And this is a much cheaper way of actually bringing in and you'd be surprised, we've done some really decent, big size events using this technology.
That is crazy. That is crazy.
So that's, I think, really interesting.
Right.
It's really making it much more accessible. And that's what technology here is specifically done in the last couple of years.
So you mentioned multiple languages. Now that's one thing that even so I follow the NBA very closely, and that's what they are doing, right? They do a Hindi broadcast a Hindi commentary. As a matter of fact, they plan to go into multiple languages, and ISL's been doing that. Kabaddi's been doing it. Is that, in your opinion, the biggest cultural change that broadcast has seen in India, or is there something else that the naked eye cannot see, like people like me who are on the outside cannot see?
So honestly, I think, unfortunately, or, consumers believe today that, language is only audio. Whereas when you actually look at a broadcast, there are multiple ways by which broadcasters are now trying to make sure that your feed is customized to you.
Okay.
It is very similar to how an OTT space works. When a Netflix or an Amazon speaks, they say they want to understand your viewing patterns and then bring you. So if you're, something really interesting that I read that Netflix is doing is they actually try and see the kind of content that you watch personally, and assuming you're a big Kevin Spacey fan, for instance.
Right.
And the next series of House of Cards has Kevin Spacey. The promos that will be cut will only have Kevin Spacey as your viewing experience.
So on Netflix, when you view
so when you access your particular feed, it will push only those promos that will have your favorite star or your favorite actor, so that your inclination to watch that content becomes bigger.
Got it.
What broadcasters are doing today parallelly is, because sports is one medium which is enjoyed a lot in terms of with people on a larger screen. It's
Yes.
not really, you know, a personal experience.
Absolutely, which is why we watch on bigger screens. We want to recreate that live experience, right?
And what's happening now is that from a regional point of view, one is, you know, what a challenge that we understood, while we were doing regional programming is the younger generation today essentially can listen and understand, but they probably can't read the language that is, you know, because they've now in schools or whatever, they've not really. So we've tried to complement that in terms of regional graphics, so that while you're catering in terms of your audio to a certain category of consumers,
Right.
or an age group, your written graphics is helpful to a much older consumer who actually understands and believes this is part of, you know, a feed that is coming to me.
Got it.
A level further than that is customizing your visuals. So
Okay.
if you actually watch a feed today on a network like Star Sports, for instance, a cricket match feed in Hindi is different from a cricket match feed in English, is different from a cricket match feed in Tamil, is different from a cricket match feed in any other language.
I had no clue about this.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what's really interesting is there are multiple unilateral cameras that we put during production now, where you can actually, I am a Hindi avid viewer, and in the game I see there is Virat Kohli, and say for example, or a better example is I'm a Tamil viewer and a Hindi viewer, and in the stadium you actually see both Rajnikant and Virat Kohli in the game for an IPL game or any of the other big one-day internationals, for instance. A Tamil viewer will see Rajnikant, whereas a Hindi viewer will see Virat Kohli.
And it makes complete sense because that's what you want to resonate at the end of the day, right?
Absolutely.
You want to emotionally charge them.
Yes, and even in terms of commentary and how you would customize it is, you would actually on the Tamil feed, I would talk about R. Ashwin. I will show him more than actually, you know, a Hindi viewer would be more interested in, say, Jasprit Bumrah, for instance.
Right.
And, you know, because as a Hindi or an English viewer, I'm more interested, or I'm more connected with the space that I am around. You know, I know my players from the north. I know, you know, what their statistics are. And that's the level of customization that we are actually going into. And that's what will make you believe that this feed is for me. This is personalized for me.
Got it.
Because another aspect that's really interesting is that, you know, English and Hindi, now there is so much done already that the maximum expansion that can happen is actually in the regional space.
Okay.
Is a point that we've kind of sort of realized that it could work out really well in terms of reaching out to those audiences and masses who always believe that, you know, cricket is, you know, English production or you know, there wasn't any regional language.
Right. So one of the things you and I've always found really fascinating after having spoken to you is how you guys customize your deliverables to regional viewers. I had no clue you guys do this from a camera and like even just a TV viewing experience. But this kind of thing makes me wonder. So in the previous conversation we had, you mentioned multiple sports at the same time. Thing is, and you also started this conversation saying India has largely been a one sport country. We still are to a very large extent, as a matter of fact. But one of the things I found really fascinating over the past, I would say, couple of years, and more so these past 2-3 months, is that India has largely always been a one sport at a time country, right? We watch a cricket tournament over 6 weeks, and then we move on to the football tournament, we move on to other tournaments. And this is specifically about Indian sport, right? We obviously continue to watch Premier League over the year, over the course of the year. But at this point of time, we have 3 very active leagues / tournaments going on where India is actively involved. So you have football, which is in the ISL, you have the Pro Kabaddi League, and you have the India-Australia series. Is that a good thing or a bad thing that we're becoming... let me rephrase that question. It's a good thing that we're watching more sport. There's never a downside to it. But now that this evolution is happening, where we're being able to consume multiple sports at a time, and considering we've always been a one sport at a time country, there's this worry that we're not giving enough of attention to one sport so that we can focus on it a little deeper. And, in some way contribute to its development. Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing?
So, if we talk about development, from a broadcaster's perspective, I don't think that's the case really, because we have separate teams that are dedicated to ensuring the experience never drops
For each
for each sport.
yeah.
Yes, and those are dedicated teams in terms of whether it is the on-field experience, the players, the engagement, franchise, all of that put together. From a viewer's perspective, yes, you're spoiled for choices. There are multiple things happening. In India, we go by prime time, which is really really big. Other countries do as well, but you typically have the 7 to 9, 10 period, which is your evening prime time, and you try and consume everything in that. The challenge there is to how to make sure that the viewership pie is the same. That essentially is getting distributed across multiple sports.
Right.
In that sense, and that could be a very good thing in terms of options, but it might not be that great a thing in terms of revenue.
Right.
And while we don't, while I'm not really involved in that side, in terms of the actual commercials or revenue piece, but the understanding is it is always a challenge. You're better off building one thing at a time and preparing viewers for something that's coming up next. But multiple sports in that sense might not be a bad thing, but I think it's it could get a little complex in terms of how you want to drive viewership for audiences that probably, to give you an example, football, there are a lot of people who only watch football World Cup to World Cup. They probably don't watch in between. So when you're trying to build affinity to a certain sport, how do you make sure that, if so much is happening, how do you get the same viewer to watch all three at the same time?
Right. But don't you think that's being helped in a large way with more consumers now in India, or more consumers in India watching stuff on their mobile phones, right? So I can watch a cricket match on my mobile phone while I'm watching an ISL match on my TV, for instance, and have maybe a kabaddi match on my iPad. Do you think that is something that we will evolve towards figuring out a way how, because you said there may be some commercial challenges and some challenges in terms of drawing viewership, but if you figure out how to optimize these multiple devices, do you think that's something that can help down the line?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, for us, we see digital platforms that essentially, broadcast channels are limited to a certain number. Sports, OTT platforms are not. They can carry anything subject to bandwidth and capability. But we are seeing that a lot. The OTT is becoming a second screen experience, whether it is interactivity to an extent or, like you said, I might be watching my primary sport on television, and if I want to follow a secondary sport, I have the option of watching it on OTT, and that's the comfort that I have now. Technology wise, we are augmenting where we see how we can actually give you the OTT experience on broadcast and the other way around. So we did something called the red button, which was essentially, if I'm watching cricket, how do I give you additional feeds? So, something like a Virat Cam, for example.
Okay.
Or, another game's highlights, Kabaddi's highlights when there is a break for cricket. So, you essentially, we did it on platforms like Tata Sky and others. You essentially press the red button, it'll take you to multiple window screens and you can choose the window that you want to watch.
I had no clue about this. Right.
So, that's, one will have to find ways to try and give more in the same time that is available from a viewership point of view.
Right. So you mentioned with regards to this red button, and I think we've had this conversation once before, but I don't quite remember the details. It seems as though it's a lot of work to be able to give the consumers a choice of being able to see multiple angles and multiple screens, right? Do you think? Did you guys do? Is that an option you are giving the consumers as something cool, or do you all see somewhere down the line people being able to actually derive more value out of that?
No, absolutely. I think it's value. What we realized very quickly was that if you compare it to OTT is an interactive medium. Broadcast is always one way. There is no way of what you receive is what you get.
Correct.
What we realized with some of the more evolved platforms where you had the option of doing language buttons or had the option of doing visual buttons, we said, rather than it being one-off cool option of saying I can watch multiple games, it also gives us the flexibility of giving that particular viewer, say assuming Premier League, there are days when you do 10 matches on a Sunday. and you typically only have 2 or 3 channels dedicated to bringing those channels. The red button gives you the viewer the option of saying, okay, I don't want to see a Chelsea game, I would want to experience a Liverpool game. So some of the more I would say it is adding additional flavor to what you can see, and two, for a little more serious fan, you give them options of being able to have a similar OTT kind of experience on a much larger screen.
Right. So, whatever you've told me so far sounds like a lot of work. And this is actually a personal question in a way I wanted to ask you, because there are times where I'm so frustrated with a television or with a broadcast, with some broadcasting, that I want to throw a shoe at the TV. What is, in your opinion, the most misunderstood aspect of the broadcasting industry, especially keeping India as a market in mind? What is the most misunderstood aspect of the broadcasting industry that Indian consumers don't understand?
So I think what people don't realize is what happens at the back end, like you said. So it's not just bringing a tournament and picking up the rights and broadcasting it. There are multiple aspects to it. India is a market that is totally driven by ratings, and we are, advertising is far greater than subscription at this point in time.
Right.
There is a big debate going on in the new TRAI regulation, and which essentially talks about a la carte channels versus a bundle of 300 plus channels that you used to get at one point in time. At the broadcasters end, it's very, very critical that multiple steps are taken. So right from acquisition of rights to scheduling it in the right manner, making sure it's available on the grid at a certain amount of time, prioritizing the games, because if I have 14 channels and I have 20 events, how do I make sure that I do justice to all of them? From a consumer's perspective, yes, why do you take rights to 20 if you only have 14? I don't think anybody else has the capability, one, to invest to be able to expand at that level. That is why OTT is complemented us really well. We make sure we carry all of those 20 events or games without compromise on the OTT platform, and still keep broadcast to the larger pockets of people who don't have access to OTT. India is a market where I would say 80% is still single TV homes. And that's a really interesting phenomenon, because you don't have access to sharing. Like in my house, there are 3 televisions.
Right.
And, 3, whether it's my parents, me, or my wife, for example, can decide and watch what we want to. But appointment viewing, in terms of in a house where everybody will sit together and watch one thing, is still very, very predominant. So we want to make sure, as a broadcaster, you schedule it right. You make sure that piece of entertainment or sport that is relevant to a much larger audience, a big family, for instance, is how it is scheduled. So what sometimes we see, or what you and I would discuss, is a very metro-centric, minuscule audience that essentially doesn't even affect viewing habits that people have within the country.
Right.
But it's a very, very big, drastic change from feeling as a consumer. There are times that I sometimes feel extremely frustrated at saying, what, my favorite game is not being shown on television. The only way that I can see it is being in office, because I will make sure we bring everything in.
Right.
Even if it doesn't go out.
That's why Manchester United is having a great year on Indian television. Right.
Yeah, so I mean that's where it is at this point. Some of those challenges always remain. Till the time, our hope is that we should have one sports channel in every single house in this country. We should be in a position where you've seen the regional expansion in sports.
Sorry, I want you to help. I want your help in clarifying. What do you mean by one sports channel in every?
So what I mean is, you would only see Hindi and English. To my earlier point, there are 28 languages and that many states or whatever. How do I make sure that I'm catering to every single house?
God.
How do I make sure? And that's what will make this nation a nation of sport. The
Right.
moment you're able to see experience is when you are able to say, okay, I want to emulate this. Today kids want to be a Messi or a Ronaldo,
Right.
because not necessarily they've seen them in person.
Right.
They've seen them on television or on broadcast.
Right.
As
Right.
a matter of fact, and and that's what's really going to bring the change. That awareness will bring the change. Is why you have so many Manchester United supporters,
Right.
because in the late 90s, early 2000s, the only games that were broadcast were United in Asia.
Right.
So,
Right.
not purely by choice, but it's, what was given to you is, everybody started believing or
Right.
knowing it is the best team. It is the best team, but,
Right.
that's...
David, we have to edit this part out. Okay, so but it's interesting you mentioned this point because somebody else brought this up. Do you, I mean, basis what you know and from the broadcasting industry, do you know why around the late 90s, early 2000s, Manchester United was so predominant on Indian television? Was there a particular reason, or it just happened to be that, and they were even at that time, still are the most global team? Was that just a factor of them being a global team that Indian audiences ended up getting to see more Manchester United?
No, I think it was again, and this goes back to your acquisition and rights.
Exactly. So it ties into that, which is why I asked the question.
Is why everybody would have wanted to see, they went through a unprecedented rise of, 12 or 13 seasons of winning trophies. They won the treble in 99. They had some of the big stars at that point, and everybody wanted to see, there was no second team at that point.
Right.
So even when broadcasters would go in, they would typically say, today why the only game that is predominant in a La Liga is Real Madrid versus Barcelona.
Correct, the Clásico, yeah.
So there's no other game that is, people would probably only come and watch one particular game. And that's why I think there was probably limited airtime available at that point.
Right.
And you had to make specific choices on what you would broadcast. And, maybe in that 2 hours that were available for international sport, it made more sense to broadcast a Manchester United game than any other.
Right, and you were right in the sense that again, I wasn't fortunate enough to watch those games at that time, but I do know they had a bunch of global stars, and they have been a global team now for almost 25 years. So it was just interesting. I thought maybe that was the perspective that you had. We've discussed a lot in this podcast, PK, but I think one of the things we like to do at Nation of Sports, there's always this conversation about why India is not a nation of sport, and we understand that, and it's one of the reasons we even chose the name for our website. But we are not from the school of thought where, and that's why we bring guests like that, which is we are not from the school of thought of criticism. We are from the school of thought of, okay, this is the reality right now. How is that reality going to change? How can we make it better? So, knowing what you know and having been in the broadcast industry in India for more than a decade, what are some of the things, I would say, let's be specific. Give me 2 things that you would change or you would like to see change over the course of, say, the next 5 to 10 years. I would say 5 years because, 10 years is a very long time nowadays. 5 years is like, you can get a lot done in 5 years, right? So what are the 2 things you would like to see personally change over the next 5 years?
So, you mentioned a really interesting point in terms of, the positives.
Right.
2 things, from a broadcaster's perspective, what I want to say firstly is, we've made sure that we don't remain a broadcaster. And, one of the big reasons why some of the bigger broadcasters has remained away from, events like esports, for instance, because you want to make sure the real sport always stays out there.
Right.
And, 2 changes that I can pinpoint specifically. One is getting to see more grassroots or getting to see more college and junior level games on broadcast.
Like it happens in the US, like the NCAA, for instance.
Yes,
right.
And that is what will automatically get, you don't have to realize that dream when you become a professional, when you're at that level. And we are bringing it, to more and more reality, being able to do stuff where you can bring these small pockets or games that happen in an isolated space or leagues at a junior level, where it becomes that much more visible. Right. And that's what's going to really change things as we go along.
Right.
And secondly, I think the capability of changing the whole mindset of how, sports as an industry functions.
Okay.
People today don't realize, for them, an athlete, what goes behind an athlete, the big support system. And that's what I think the government is building as well today, having the right, not just the coach, it's the entire support system of physios or, strength and conditioning experts. And you have to have an ecosystem that can build that athlete and take him to the next level. I remember you had mentioned in one of our conversations earlier that, a basketball, a kid who's in India at a certain age is at the same level as, somebody in the US, for
Right,
example.
right. Like, yeah, I would say a college kid in India, for example, is at the level of a high school kid, or slightly a kid before high school in the US. Yeah.
And it changes, drastically after a certain period.
Right,
So I think
right.
that support.
Oh, sorry. I understood what you were getting at. I was saying, yes, to a certain point of time, Indian kids are at par
Yes.
with international kids. But
Right.
it's after. So okay, the ecosystem, yes, and after a certain point of time, because the Indian kid doesn't have access to that ecosystem, the American kids or the Western kids tend to exponentially get better.
Get better.
Get it. Yes, yes. Fair enough.
So I think those two things, and they've already started changing. I mean, I've played cricket almost professionally many years ago, and I always look back now saying if IPL had happened when we were playing cricket, we would have probably been in a much better position.
I'd be sitting here with you and interview. There'd be two bodyguards outside, probably a massively huge entourage outside, right?
Yeah, but those are the things. It's really evolved. You see that many more kids out there today. Parents are trying to look for some level of professional coaching, some level of even if nobody knows whether you'll become a professional athlete or not.
Right.
But if you try and at least chart that path in terms of a few years, 3, 4, 5, 7 years, those are specifics that are really changing as we see.
Got
Both
it.
on a viewer side as well as an active individual who's saying, I would want to be part of something like this.
Right. There was a ton of information to consume, and I sincerely once again thank you, PK. You've not just been a mentor in a way. You've been a very good friend, always a crazy soundboard, in a good way. But where can some of our viewers and our listeners find you? You're active on social media. Where can they find you, for instance?
So I'm not so active on social media. I mean, it's only subject to any specific information or anybody reaches out. LinkedIn is probably the only place that I'm a little more active as compared to any of the others.
And it's Prashant Khanna.
That's right.
On
Prashant.Khanna is where you can actually find me.
Excellent. Thank you once again for coming on the show. I am hoping this is not the last time. We'll tempt you with more juicy offers in terms of lunch and drinks when you come in the next time. Once again, I keep repeating myself. Thank you so much, Prashant, for being on the council.
Thanks.